As the war in Ukraine continues to drag on, all eyes continue to be on Washington to find out what President Trump is going to do next. He's talked a lot about what he may do. He's given a few signs here and there. General Keith Kellogg, his emissary to the Russia-Ukraine war, has made a couple of comments here and there. But so far, and the Russians have been saying this themselves, they're looking for signals to when negotiations are actually going to start and what the terms are that President Trump wants. Because so far, he said that he wants a deal, but he hasn't said what he thinks the deal should look like. And so we want to find out really what kind of leverage does Trump actually have, and what can we expect out of the discussions here. And there's nobody better to do that than Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran and definite friend of the show. Colonel, first of all, welcome back.
Good to be here, Dan.
It's always great to have you because I know you've always got some inside information. You've got good context in place, but just a great analytical mind that cuts through the BS and just cuts through what people want to believe and just kind of what is. And so as we look to this here, I just wonder what your kind of general 30,000 foot level beliefs are about what you think the Trump administration thinks it's going to be able to accomplish in Ukraine.
Well, that's a hard question because based on all the comments to this point in time, they seem to think that they've got the ability to shape the outcome from Washington. And I don't think they do. The other problem is I'm not sure that President Trump has really decided what it is that he wants from Russia. I mean, that may sound strange, but all the thinking I see, all the comments that I hear are all very short term in focus. In other words, if you're President Trump and his advisors, I think they're telling him, Mr. President, here's an easy win for you. If you do this, this will be a big win. And Trump is a marketing genius. He's somebody who understands the media and understands how to market himself and ideas. And I think he's looking at it in a similar way. How do I pitch this so that we get a big win for the administration out of this, without really understanding that this is not about a win in the marketplace. This is not about a short-term splash. This is not about credit with the media and the public. This is a very serious matter now. And I keep asking, I was on the phone, frankly, yesterday with someone, and they were telling me, well, we have to do this, have to do that, and so forth. And I said, wait a minute, what do you want from Russia? And finally, the man, after repeatedly dodging the question, said, well, what do you think we want from Russia? I said, I think we want from Russia the same thing that Russia wants from us: peace and cooperation.
And in fact, here's this is one of the comments that Trump has made that may give a clue as to what he thinks. Here's how he put it.
Zelensky wants to make a deal. I don't know if Putin does. He might not. I don't know. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia by not making a deal. I think Russia's going to be in big trouble. You take a look at their economy. You take a look at the inflation in Russia. So I would hope. I got along with him great, and I would hope he wants to make a deal.
It seems, Doug, to me that kind of inherent in his comments there makes me wonder if whether it's intelligence individuals or just some of his close advisors seem to be telling Trump that Russia is in need of a negotiated settlement, that they're hurting, that they're losing large numbers of people or so. Is that an accurate prospect?
What's very frightening is that he actually thinks what he's saying is accurate. And we know in the world today that everything he just said is completely false. The Russian economy is not on the verge of collapse. The Russian military is stronger and more capable than it's ever been. The Russian society is cohesive and resilient. All of this is just utter and complete nonsense. The tragedy is that he has surrounded himself with people who are trying to hijack this administration the way they hijacked the first one. That means convince him of something that's not true, and then push him in a direction that results inevitably in confrontation and failure, which I think is what the people around Trump want. They want confrontation with Russia. confrontation with Iran, confrontation with virtually everyone everywhere. And President Trump has this sort of pre-designed reaction to these things that tells him, well, I've got to be strong. And if I'm going to be strong, I have to threaten. You know, this is the bully, bribe, and bomb complex. All of this is nonsense, has nothing to do with what's happening on the ground right now. But just to add to the level of delusion, he's talked in his public speeches about suppressing the price of oil. He's talked about suppressing inflation. Talked about suppressing interest rates, a whole range of things over which he, as president of the United States, has practically no control whatsoever. So he conveys the impression to people that he's there. He's going to right all the wrongs of the last 4 years. He's going to turn the spigot and bang, on comes the oil and the natural gas. The problem is we have not adequately invested in oil and natural gas for years. And you can't incentivize that industry to do something overnight that it's unclear is ever going to happen. In other words, he's deluding the public. I think this is going to have terrible consequences. In the first place, it'll have consequences is in Ukraine. I do not see any evidence that the Russian government is prepared to cede anything to us or quote unquote NATO, whatever that is at this point, because I think it's largely an empty facade. It's just us and a group of people that we call NATO.
And actually, I want to put that up there because you mentioned the oil issue. This is one of the comments coming in from his Russia-Ukraine czar, General Keith Kellogg.
The most important thing I think everybody needs to understand, it's not going to end kinetically. What I mean by that, it's not going to end by killing each other. This is going to end, and he said this yesterday when he was at Davos, that the key role of not only diplomacy, but economics as well. Let me just use one example, oil. You know, the price of oil right now is probably, when you look at Brent or WTI, the baseline pricing, it's about $78 a barrel. So Russia's getting billions of dollars of money from oil sales. What if you drop that to $45 a barrel, which is basically the baseline break-even point? That's what he made the comment yesterday. And this is where the president comes from. He comes from it economically, and he comes from it diplomatically. That's how we're going to finish this thing off. It's not going to be done by killing each other.
Well, let's look at the first prospect that he said there first, that this war is not going to end by one side killing the other. Is that a safe bet? Is it not possible for the Russians to actually have a military victory?
Absolutely. They've already had military victory. You know, there's no question about that. If they decide to cross the river and march all the way to the Polish border, who's going to stop them? Are we? Are the troops sitting in Poland, spending their times in bars and nightclubs and running around after Polish girls, as I suspect many of them do? Are they ready? Are they vigorously trained? Are they ready for a form of warfare that we're unfamiliar with? I think the answer is all no. So it's just nonsense. Everything that Kellogg said is nonsense. Imagine, even if it were possible, and it's not possible for us to drive the price down to $25 a barrel, but if it were, what would that do to our domestic oil and natural gas industry?
Right.
Catastrophic.
Yeah.
This is just stupid. This is a one long string of stupidities strung together. You know, President Trump needs to get rid of all these people. They're giving him such bad advice. We cannot determine the outcome in eastern Ukraine. We don't have the power, we don't have the resolve, and we do not have the backing of the American people for a major regional war to influence anything. So who's going to decide the outcome? Answer, Moscow. Moscow will decide the outcome. Who is this man Zelensky? He is nothing. He is a puppet at the top of a criminal regime, an organized crime state that we've kept flush with cash. He can go tomorrow morning if we want him to go. This has no use whatsoever to talk about Zelensky as an important player. He has no legitimacy. He's done everything in his power to shut down democracy, destroy human rights. It's a waste of time even speaking about Zelensky. He just needs to be removed. And if the United States government wants him to go, he will go.
Well, apparently the United States government at least hasn't so far wanted him to go. And another constituency that doesn't seems to be the European Union, because they gave him a big opportunity here to speak in front of a group at Davos.
If there are no strong security guarantees, no NATO, no military contingent deployed, no long-range weaponry, how do you think, if Putin comes back, he will definitely come back with the army 10 times more than the grouping he had in the very beginning of 2022, because it is already almost 4.5 times more than it was. And when he comes back with this grouping for the full occupation of the countries that are former republics of the USSR, that is number one, and then he will do what he has done with our Crimea. He will be coming to other EU and NATO countries to stand there, to issue those ultimatums, to make demands to the countries. He will be bringing us and you, everybody, to the world that lives in his head. This is what will be happening in case there are no strong security guarantees.
I thought it was ironic that there at the end he said that Putin is the one who is creating fiction in his head that doesn't exist. And gracious, when you look at a map and you look at the what's happened over the last, 18 months or so, just as a minimum, there's probably somebody who's not looking at things realistically, and it isn't coming out of Moscow.
Well, this is an artificial world created by the so-called globalists, neocons, whatever you want to call them, that have hijacked our government and gained control of most of the governments, certainly in Western Europe. And in this artificial world, those kinds of statements are taken seriously. We know they're all nonsense. President Putin has absolutely no interest in marching further west, but he's going to do whatever is required to secure his country's interests in Eastern Europe. That's very simple. And right now, that's stabilizing Eastern Ukraine, coming to a new territorial arrangement, and hopefully with us and our so-called European allies, some sort of arrangement regarding the size and movement of forces. You know, one of the more disturbing things that I've heard recently is an attempt to link nuclear arms reductions to some sort of deal in Ukraine. The Russians are happy to talk to us about reductions in nuclear armaments, but it's not going to be linked to Ukraine. Ukraine is an entirely different set of circumstances, but it's back to this notion of we want Ukraine to join NATO. By the time this war ends, I don't think there will be a NATO. This is self-delusion on a titanic scale. You know, there's something else that's wrong here. President Trump is not a stupid man. He knows this is not his war. He's under no obligation to pick it up and carry it forward. He's making a mistake that Nixon made in 1968 or 1969 by pressing forward into Cambodia, widening the war, ultimately sustaining more casualties, more human losses after he becomes president than Johnson sustained while he was president. This is unnecessary. President Trump needs to get out of it. He has a very, very ambitious domestic policy agenda. If he wants to achieve anything with that domestic policy agenda, he needs to shut down these overseas adventures. None of these things are important to us as Americans, not a bit.
I want to zero in on the first thing that Zelensky was saying there, though. You talk about there's an agenda with what a lot of the Western European countries want, et cetera. And obviously they seems to be very intent and happy to do anything that's going to, quote, harm Russia. But that has a limit. And if it harms them too much, apparently, there could be some limit there. Do you think there's any prospect that Zelensky was asking there that he wants literal security guarantees from Europe? Is there any states in Europe that are willing to go to war to Russia in order to protect Zelensky?
Not that I'm aware, although Starmer's London government has made noises in that direction. Of course, Starmer's government is on slippery ice these days. I don't think he's going to last much longer. I think he's about to go the way of Liz Truss. Bismarck was asked, I think in 1875, what would you do if the British Army landed on the shores of Germany? Bismarck scoffed and said, well, I'd send the police out to arrest it. And people sort of stood back and said, what does he mean? Well, what he meant was very true. The British Army was so small, so incapable, that it posed absolutely no threat to the German state or the German people. And if that was going to be an instrument of strategic statecraft, it would fail. Well, you've got a similar situation today. Anybody in Europe who stands up and talks about we're going to punish Russia militarily, short of nuclear weapons, and of course the use of any nuclear weapon is instantaneous suicide. But if you're going to try and do it at all, you're going to be annihilated. The Russians will annihilate them. They're very practiced now. They understand how this new form of warfare works.
Well,
So
now,
I think,
actually, Doug, on that line, I want to ask you something. I'm gonna pull up here from your book, Margin of Victory, which you published here before, and in one of these sections here, you're talking about stuff that happened during World War II, and I think it's very instructive here because one of the reasons people don't believe what you just said, that the Russian army is all that they need to be worried about it, and why some even think it's possible to give security guarantees, is because they see what happened in the Kherson city, where Russia was forced out in the early or the late summer of 2022, and the Kharkiv area where they were pushed out a lot too. So a lot of the popular belief is that Russia was a lot weaker than they thought, and they probably still are. But here's something that you wrote that I think is very instructive. I don't know if you can tell me how this applies to this current situation. You wrote, during the night of 14-15 September 1941, the armored spearheads of two German armies met at Lokitsa, 120 miles east of Kiev, forming an iron ring around 1.6 million Soviet troops. In what turned into the greatest battle of annihilation in recorded human history, the German Wehrmacht destroyed 4 entire Soviet armies and most of 2 others, inflicting 1 million casualties and capturing 665,000 Soviet soldiers. So one might think that with that level of losses, the war is going to be over right then. But as you continue on, less than 3 years later, on 22 June 1944, the third anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, 2.5 million Soviet troops launched an offensive, striking German Army Group Center along a 360-mile front offensive, ending at a great semicircle at the Moser on the Pripyat River to the Darwana River. Without interference from the German Luftwaffe, Soviet spearheads had advanced over 125 miles in less than 12 days. By the time the Soviets recaptured Minsk on 3 July, 25 divisions and 250,000 troops had simply vanished. How did Russia go from losing a million and almost 1.6 million people total to then turn it around just 3 years later to go on this juggernaut? And is there any comparison to the current Russian military?
well, let me reference something else that some people in the audience may remember, that the Romans suffered catastrophic defeats at the hands of Hannibal, but the Romans built their forces up, restored their forces, changed their forces, adapted them, and eventually they ground the Carthaginians into the dust. You had something similar that happens during World War II. Now, admittedly, I know the Russians don't like to talk about this sort of thing, but we destroyed Germany's oil industry. So by June of 1945, there was enough fuel to keep one German aircraft in the air for about 2 hours, which of course is nothing. And most of the German aircraft were above German cities, trying to prevent the cities from being annihilated from the air by the US and British Air Forces. So this was of enormous value to the Russians, who no longer had to deal with effective German tactical air support. The point is, though, that the Russians always have and have always had the advantage of falling back into the interior. When the Mongols destroyed Kiev in the 13th century, or I guess it's the 13th century, they fell back and then finally moved north. That's why the center of gravity for Eastern Slavic civilization and Christianity moves north to where it is now in Moscow and Smolensk, because the Mongols destroyed Kiev. And they came back again and again and again. They have the depth, they have the cohesion, they have the willpower, the resolve, and the determination. And so we've seen that happen here again. The Russians confronted an enemy they frankly had underestimated. They were aware that we were building a force composed of Ukrainians designed to threaten Russia. They knew that. They knew they needed to intervene to stop it, but they had no idea how strong it was, how much power it could mobilize. And finally, they underestimated their ability to impress us with the small force they sent in to begin with. Well, that's history, meaningless today. And the destruction of Army Group Center is not a bad analogy for what's happened to the Ukrainians. They are on the verge of going out of business completely. And I wish somebody would stand up and tell the truth, and that includes President Trump, because if he has a humanitarian bone in his body, he should seek to stop this war, period. Stop the losses on all sides. We do not benefit from the deaths of Russians or Ukrainians. I don't know why anybody would say such a thing. But then again, I look at the people who've hijacked control of our government over the last several years and how much hatred they seem to feel for Russia and how much hatred they seem to feel for everyone in the Middle East. I guess that's the explanation, but it doesn't make any sense to us as Americans. We have no interest in this mass murder that has been going on. None.
Well, don't. And one wonders if that's going to be forced upon those that are in power here, because I showed you both Trump and Kellogg, who seem to both confidently think that Russia's hurting and therefore they're in need of a negotiated settlement. But then when you look and see what the Ukraine side or the Russian side is saying, they are not quite as tentative as one might think in light of what's going on here. We've had Sergei Lavrov, who said, absolutely no circumstances will we do a ceasefire or a pause, because that was only help the other side and it would harm Russia because Russia's on the advantage. And then you see Putin himself, who seems, pretty confident.
What we need is not just a ceasefire. We need peace, a long-lasting peace.
We don't have any preconditions for talks. We are ready to engage in a conversation without preconditions. But there has to be a basis of something that we've agreed upon during the talks in Istanbul in late 2022. And based, of course, on the realities on the ground at this moment.
He's talking about realities on the ground. I think that what he has in mind and why he is so confident is, first of all, we have General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, is admitting straight up that they don't have, even with forced mobilization, they can't bring enough troops in. So they are already, every single day, are suffering a net loss to their combat capacity. You've also got here in just the last few weeks, you have first the famous 155th Brigade that was trained in Paris to much fanfare, disintegrated before it even got to the front line. And then now here a couple of days ago, you had the 155th Brigade, a new brigade that was formed in Ukraine itself, likewise fell apart before it came. So I think Putin can see that the forces arrayed against him are literally falling apart by the day. So he can confidently say, I'm not interested in his ceasefire, but he does want a peaceful solution. Do you think that Russia is just saying that and that maybe they're not as strong as they believe? Or do you think he's right?
Well, you also have this man, Budanov, who is the leader of the State Committee on Intelligence in Kiev. And Budanov is nothing if not a complete fanatic, devoted to the idea of killing and destroying as many Russians as possible. And he's effectively said the same thing, that unless extreme measures are adopted, the war is effectively over. Ukraine will not survive. Now, one of the reasons I bring him up is that there's been some talk in the press about some sort of false flag nuclear event with either a nuclear reactor or a dirty bomb or something else. And I would tell you that the one individual whose group is capable of just that sort of insanity is Budanov. And I hope everybody pays attention to that name and watches that very carefully, because that's something that he could do, I think, if he has the right resources at his disposal. And remember, he's strongly backed by the CIA and MI6. Now, the war is effectively over. That's true. But there's a different way to look at everything that President Putin has just said. If you're sitting where President Trump is, knowing his views geostrategically on Europe and NATO, this is an opportunity to do two things. First, go ahead, suspend the aid, military aid to Ukraine. That will bring the war to an end. Then pull out immediately all American military and non-military personnel, intelligence. It doesn't make any difference. Bring them all out. Get all the Americans out of Ukraine. And then simply send a note to President Putin that when it's convenient, that we're willing to discuss a larger solution to the security situation in Central East Europe, because the war itself is over. We're not talking about the war anymore. That's a done deal, so to say. President Trump needs to understand that. He has an opportunity, though, now to come to a larger agreement with the Russians in Europe. That's a very important thing to do, because Putin wants peace in Europe. The Europeans want peace with Russia. We should want peace with Russia and cooperation with Russia. There is no particular strategic reason why we should be in conflict with Moscow. I would argue that there hasn't been any since Stalin was in power. But the bottom line is, that's where we should be thinking right now. If we meet with the Russians, let's listen to them. What is their proposal for a security arrangement in Europe that prevents any further bloodshed, any further warfare from breaking out? We should do that. Then we can sit back and say, well, we agree with this and this. We're not too keen on that and that. In other words, you can pick and choose and you can talk. You know, this is called diplomacy and negotiation. But what we don't need is to lobotomize ourselves, which is effectively what we're doing right now by answering anything that comes across the desk as, if you don't do what we want, we're going to bully you. We're going to tariff you. We're going to harm you. You know, you're not going to have much success with that. Biden's been doing that, since 2022? Look how successful he's been. So this is all nonsense.
So what do you say?
Somebody has to present that to the president in an unambiguous fashion. This is a once in a several decades opportunity to come to an arrangement that could work to the benefit of us, as well as the Russians and the people living in Ukraine and the rest of Europe.
So what do you say to the Mark Rutte, who just I guess about 10 days ago went in front of a panel of NATO leaders and said, we have to keep strengthening Ukraine, because if we don't, Russia will just continue moving on to the West. What do you say to that?
Is this Rubio?
Rutte, Mark Rutte.
Oh, Rutte, the Dutchman. He's irrelevant. He's a puppet. We just put people into these jobs that are going to say whatever we tell them to say. That was true for his predecessor, Stolberg, from Norway. Now we have Rutte, the Dutchman. Forget them. They're irrelevant. The elites in Europe are done. They're finished. Let me explain. In every nation in Europe, there is a right-wing nationalist government waiting to take over. Whether they get into power next week, in 6 months, or a year, I can't predict, but they're coming. And they deserve power, because they are telling their people exactly what, you, I, and many other Americans have told our own people. We are America first. We need to focus on what's happening here at home. There is no reason for us to be involved in conflicts in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, with Russia, or anybody else. And that's what the Germans, the French, I think eventually the British, the rest of the Europeans are all coming around to this understanding. This is not 1936. It's not 1939. It's not 1945. This is a different world. And we should be concerned about our survival, the survival of our states, our way of life, our culture, our languages, our civilization. That's where we should focus. That has been Putin's focus. That's why he's winning and we are losing.
Now, you say that there's the change is coming in the West and among the European leaders. Change hasn't got here yet, other than maybe Fico in Slovakia and Viktor Orban in Hungary. But so far, the rest of them are still in the old way. Here is Kaja Kallas, the foreign minister for the European Union, talking about what she thinks is the reality on the ground.
For too long, we have offered Russia alternatives, hoping that it would choose cooperation and economic prosperity for its people over fraudulent imperialistic ambitions. But instead, Russia's defense industry is churning out tanks, glide bombs, artillery shells in vast quantities. Together, EU member states' economies are 17 times bigger than that of Russia's economy. We must force his hand to show him that he will lose. and stop him before he attacks one of our own. Europe's failure to invest in military capabilities also sends a dangerous signal to the aggressor. Weakness invites them in. President Trump is right to say that we don't spend enough. It's time to invest. We all need to be realistic about Russia. Russia poses existential threat to our security today, tomorrow, and for as long as we underinvest in our defense.
So to what extent, Doug, do you think that she believes any of that stuff? Or is it like, no, this is just what we have to say because the key word there is invest, i.e. spend a lot more in the defense industry? Or does she actually believe that? What is your view on what they're saying?
A couple of points. First of all, is this lovely Miss Kaya Kallas, is she from Lithuania?
I'm actually not sure where she's from.
I think you should find out. I think she's probably from Lithuania. If not, she could be from Latvia, potentially. Or Estonia. The reason I'm bringing that up is that the people in those countries were traumatized by the Second World War and their mistreatment at the hands of communists, which is why they greeted the liberating German forces with flowers and bread and salt and so forth, just as they did in Ukraine. These people have never gotten past that trauma, and they are believing in a Russia that doesn't exist today. That is a Soviet-style state led by Stalin and millions of soldiers ready to sacrifice themselves and rape, pillage, murder, and burn. That's just nonsense. So that's part of the problem. I don't know how you fix that, but if you could, maybe Gary can find out where she's from. Where is she from, Gary? Estonia.
From Wikipedia, an Estonian politician and diplomat. Yes.
Yeah, she's from Estonia, and these small countries, first of all, have very rarely been countries. You know, they were largely incorporated into other larger empires or confederations, and those countries on the Baltic, along with Scandinavia, were almost German colonies in much of the Middle Ages. We could spend a lot of time on it, but I'm trying to explain that her thinking is consistent with the attitudes and beliefs of the people that live in those areas for the last 60, 70, 80 years based upon their experience. The problem is that experience is no longer relevant because that state that was so heinous and evil that had been built up by the Bolsheviks and Stalin is gone. That is not Putin. Putin is none of those things. And we have tried relentlessly to tar and feather Putin with that reputation. So she's talking about an enemy that doesn't exist. Secondly, during World War II, the Soviets looked at how we were conducting the war and concluded that they were very fortunate. And they were fortunate insofar as they didn't have to deal with quote unquote unruly allies in the East. Oh, there were Polish-speaking divisions inside the Soviet army. There were Ukrainian-speaking forces inside the Soviet army. There were lots of different people inside the Soviet army, but they were all under the Soviet army. They were under one unified chain of command. And so those armies could be wielded as a very effective instrument. Neither we nor the Germans, the Nazi state, were able to do that. So we maintained independent formations, Hungarians and others in the East that fought with Romanians and Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and independent national formations, the Germans, and in the West, we used independent French and British and Canadian and U.S. formations. And we had to negotiate our way through the war. We had to ask people to do things. We had to build consensus. It was a catastrophe. It's one of the reasons we got so far, or I would argue we got so little in terms of distance in such a long period of time. We cannot compete in this conglomeration of nations that she's pointing to with any degree of unity of effort against Russia. The Russians have unity of effort. That's the important part. If you have unity of effort, you have unity of command. So she's smoking something, and it's probably not a cigarette.
Okay, well, that's pretty clear. So bottom line, whatever she intends, it's not really going to translate into anything positive for Europe. I want to go back again to read something from your book from later on in the same chapter that I was reading here before. because it talks about things toward the end of the war. And it seems to me that I see something playing out right now. As a preface to this, I mean, the situation right now, Velika Novoselica is the latest city to have fallen on the Ukraine side. It was one of the fastest that the Russians have been able to take a city since late 2023. Now then, they're starting to move more and more in, and evidence appears that they're about ready to start the actual assault on Pokrovsk, which could then just unhinge the entire Eastern Front, depending on how fast or how aggressive the Russians want to go onto there. But in any case, we already told you that the Ukraine side is shrinking by the day because they can't offset losses. Their formations are dissolving when they get into the front. So everything makes it look like that the war militarily is over. That sounded familiar because of what that I read here in your book earlier. You said the Wehrmacht, the German army, was defeated in World War II because Hitler and his generals disregarded one of the most important principles of international conduct articulated about 110 years earlier by Clausewitz. No one starts a war, or rather no one in his senses ought to do so, without first being clear in his mind what he intends to achieve by that war and how he intends to conduct it. The former is political purpose. The latter is operational objective. From July 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht in Russia lacked definitive operational purposes and attainable strategic objective. By 1944, January 44, the Wehrmacht's margin of victory was effectively lost. German soldiers and forces fighting with them from Finland, Hungary, Croatia, Romania, and Spain simply defended their assigned sectors to the best of their ability and often to the death. And that sounds so much like what is going on in Ukraine right now. There is no military purpose to anything they're doing. They're just hanging on to cities like Velika Novoselica, like Pokrovsk, with no connection to anything else. And how can it have any outcome other than what happened to the Germans in 1945?
Well, to go back to the beginning of our discussion, everybody has talked routinely about harming Russia. What is the purpose of the proxy war against Russia? Is it to create a unified, strong, independent Ukraine that can determine its own destiny? No, it's to harm Russia. What happens to Ukraine is frankly irrelevant. No one cares. There's no one in Washington sobbing over the loss of 1.2 million Ukrainian lives, which is the current estimate that I'm looking at. No one cares. It's irrelevant. We're harming Russia. That's good. The problem is if you're looking at 90 to 100,000 Russian dead and the largest, most powerful and effective army in Europe, certainly since the end of the Second World War, I don't think we've done much harm unless it's to ourselves. So again, Clausewitz was right. What is your purpose? If anybody had looked at that from any from any logical angle, they would conclude this is insane. This is crazy. This is what you want to do. You want to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives on the assumption that doing so will harm Russia. Well, that's failed. And this goes back to the other point that I made. If you're President Trump, this is not your war. You didn't start it. You don't need it. You don't want it. Get rid of it. This is dead weight. You know, he's a businessman. When you've invested heavily in a particular stock or in a particular corporation and it fails miserably, what do? You cut your losses and you get out. That's what he needs to do. And he needs to then turn around and say, we have a different objective in Ukraine. Our objective in Ukraine now is cooperation and peace with Russia. Yes, peace. Wake up. We want peace. That is what Vladimir Putin is talking about. And this is not about he wins and we lose. No, there was never anything for us to win in Eastern Ukraine. Never. It's not Kansas. It's not Missouri. It's not Texas. All we've done is destroy the Ukrainian nation. And this puppet government that we installed in Kiev has helped to kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for nothing.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. And I just want to ask you just kind of categorically, it baffles my mind. I truly have a hard time getting there to understand because we can hardly even blame the current Trump administration so far because they haven't really done anything other than they've been in power for a week. But when you look at the previous administration, and we're talking both in and out of government, whether that's like General David Petraeus, General Ben Hodges, several other TV generals that are on all the time, the administration officials, Kaja Kallas, the Borrell before her, all these different people. You mentioned Rutte, also Stoltenberg, all of these senior people, they seem to be, I don't know, this is what I really want your view on. Is it inability to understand what used to be strategic basics like von Clausewitz, or is it that they think that somehow that they can be smarter than that and they can achieve something besides what thousands of years of human history say is the way things work? How could we be so bad and so far off the mark as a Western nation, or as a Western mindset?
There are two answers to this question. First, look at the wealth that these people have accumulated. Where does it come from? Who's been paying them and who is paying them now? You know, how many times have you and others talked about senior officers? I had a classmate who became a brigadier general, and all he could talk about was, now I have to race to 3 or 4 stars. And if I can get to 3 or 4, I can make millions. And stop and think about that. That sort of thing goes on. These people are on a payroll. They're deriving wealth from people in New York City and Washington, D.C., and the corporations, the entities, the political structures that back them. They are rewarded for their lies. And they are all on the same sheet of music because they all benefit. The problem, of course, is that the American people don't benefit. And if this continues without a halt, and that's what I fear most of all right now, and that's why I voted for President Trump, if he doesn't put a stop to this, we will be dragged further and further into this abyss. It is not impossible that at some point, Moscow says enough and pulls the plug on us. They just say, we're not worth having around. We're not going to deal with these people anymore. We're going to destroy them. And then you have more than half the world aligned against us as it is. This is catastrophic. We don't want this. This is not going to help us. So the first answer is look at where the wealth comes from. And the second part is that if you've lied repeatedly, you know, all these people that you named, how many times have they told us that the Ukrainians were on the verge of victory? Just a little more of this or a little more of that, a little more artillery ammunition, a little bit better space-based intelligence, and the Ukrainians are going to drive all the way to Moscow. How many times have you heard that nonsense? How do you back away from the lies that you told? We couldn't do that in Vietnam. And I would remind everybody that because we couldn't tell the truth about Vietnam, where we were no less confused about what we were there to do than we are today with regard to what's happening in Ukraine, Vietnam became a stain on the honor of the American people and its armed forces. We killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese for nothing. We lost over 58,000 dead with more than 100,000 wounded. That was tragic, and that was nothing compared with what the Russians had sacrificed. But the difference is that at least the Russians have fought for Russian national interest and national security. And they've done it, I think, better than perhaps anyone has in the last century in terms of avoiding the pitfalls that confront all of us on the battlefield. You, Dan, know from personal experience, as I do, how easy it is to pull the trigger and kill large numbers of people unnecessarily. It's not difficult. They haven't done that. So the stain on our honor continues today in Ukraine. This is a disgrace. We should have had nothing to do with it. Never. We've capitalized on hatreds that spring from the depths of people's souls rooted in the Second World War. It's the worst possible thing that we could do. We need to stop it. And that's why President Trump needs to stop it and get rid of these people that are hijacking him and his administration and taking it down the path to hell.
Well, I certainly hope that happens. That's definitely what I'm wanting to get this thing over with. Because, I mean, if he does, like you said earlier, if he does want his domestic agenda to go forward, this has to get off the table and quickly. They'll bitch and moan about it for a while, but then they'll, like everything else that always happens in Washington, it'll be yesterday's news and the next news cycle moved on, and he can get on to the things that matter the most, and the dying in Ukraine can stop. In the last bit of time we have here, I wonder if we could kind of shift gears a little bit. and kind of give me your assessment of what you think is going on in the Middle East with all of this stuff going on with this current fragile ceasefire holding between Israel and Gaza, the still fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and just how do you see this whole dynamic playing out, especially in light of Trump's kind of off-the-cuff comments that, well, maybe we should just clear out the Gaza Strip. How's this going to play out?
First of all, the ceasefire was always meant to be impermanent, in other words, temporary. The idea was that you give the Israeli Defense Force a break, and at the same time you get some hostages, which satisfies some of the folks on the home front. And then when it becomes useful to do so, you turn back to Gaza. President Trump has now released all of these 2,000-pound bombs that were previously impounded and given them to the Israelis. Well, I rather suspect that when this ceasefire ends, those 2,000-pound bombs will be dropped on Gaza, and the annihilation of the population there will continue. Now, I think President Trump has begun to figure that out, which is why he's gotten on the phone and made these ludicrous calls to King Abdullah in Jordan and General Sisi in Egypt saying, I want you to take these Arab refugees. Please take these refugees. In his mind, he's saying, I don't want to kill these people. I want them to live, so they have to leave. But he's shocked when he discovers that they're not going to leave. They're not going to liquidate themselves, which is effectively what I think President Trump and others are asking. They are not going to volunteer for liquidation, the end of their cause, the end of their history, the end of their identity. They're not going to do that. Now, the Mongols had a solution to this sort of thing. They sent in armies of people and decapitated tens of thousands, salted the ground, tore everything down, destroyed everything in sight. That's what they did at Kiev. That's what they did at Baghdad. We are not Mongols. We're Americans. The Israelis are giving an imitation of Mongolian warfare in Gaza, and I think to some extent also in Lebanon. Is that what we want to do? Is that what President Trump wants to do? And to suggest for a second that there's a good beachfront property in Gaza and might as well turn it over to somebody who will use it is about the most callous disregard for human life that I can imagine. I don't even want to speculate about it. I want to assume that he did not realize what he was saying, and that was an off-the-cuff remark that should be quickly forgotten.
So let me ask you that you very accurately articulated American vital national interest and interests in the Russia-Ukraine war. What is America's enduring interest in this whole conflict here and in the Middle East at large, if you could?
Well, our interest at the outset was still in the region, regionally, stability and peace. And until we began to receive the kinds of information we've been getting about what actually happened on the 7th of October, and the fact that this was hardly a surprise to people at the top of the Israeli Defense Force and intelligence structure, we thought that some campaign of vengeance, what's the right word? Help me out here.
I'm not sure where you're going.
Well, a punitive operation to punish the source was justified. A punitive operation meaning a limited operation into the region, into Gaza, to root out and destroy as much as possible those we think are principally responsible. That's what we thought. Became pretty clear a month into this that that's not what happened in Gaza. What was going on in Gaza was that this particular event, which was not a surprise, was leveraged to justify the worst possible actions by the Israelis against anyone in their neighborhood that they don't want inside their country and they don't want near their country. And that's especially true in Gaza. So that's the sad and tragic state of affairs. So what is our interest today? It's a little different from what it was then. Some people will say, well, we have to have a two-state solution. I don't see how you get a two-state solution. I don't see any evidence that the Israelis will tolerate a two-state solution. I think their mindset is either we continue to do what we're doing or we go down with the ship. They may well be on the Titanic at this point, and that's of their own doing. But I just don't see a willingness to compromise and build a two-state solution. And who is going to govern in the so-called Palestinian state? Well, it's certainly not going to be the Palestinian Authority, which they're just viewed as a group of quislings that don't represent the interests of the Palestinian Arab population. So that means you're not going to get a government in a Palestinian state that's going to be amenable to anybody in Israel. And as a result, probably nobody in Washington, since really the Israeli lobby controls our government. So I think our interest at this point is to stop killing people and to disengage and tell the Israelis that if they want to continue with this policy of mass murder and expulsion, they'll have to do it without us. But I don't see that happening, Dan. What I see is the opposite. I see that they're ready as soon as the ceasefire ends to recommence the operation, don't you?
That's certainly the way it looks to me. And comments from Netanyahu and several other leaders in Israel back that up. But what should we do? Let's say that President Trump is actually watching our show today, and after this is over, he calls you up and say, "Well, okay, we're in a mess." That he was literally handed from the previous administration, and they deserve plenty of blame for that. But now he's at the cusp of a new one. What could he do that would, I guess, the best in this messy situation, achieve American interests?
Well, if we have an interest, I think we do, but I may be wrong at this point in time in Washington. If we have an interest in cultivating good relations for both commercial and business reasons with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the various Emirates in the Persian Gulf, Egypt, Sudan, the rest of the Arab world, certainly the Turks, then we would want to stop doing what we're doing, because the only thing that we're doing right now is poisoning the well in that region against any future connectivity or benefit that we might accrue. Again, and you should talk next time you talk to Chaz Freeman, who's an expert on this region, much more so than I am. But I think he'll tell you the same thing. We've poisoned people, millions, hundreds of millions of people against us, because we are seen as the indispensable nation for Israel and its bid to murder or expel millions of people from its country. And I don't know how you get past that. This is something that's going to be with us for a long time. Just as whatever we do now, this bad experience that the Russians have had with us is going to be with them for a very, very long time. And I don't know how much headway we'll be able to make in terms of some restoration or creation of some new normality. That's the bad part. And that's why I think the only thing that you can do at this stage is say, look, if you're going to continue to do this, you're a sovereign state, you can do it. But we Americans are not going to underwrite it. We're not going to support it indefinitely. We're not going to support it unconditionally. That's true for Netanyahu. That's true for Zelensky, by the way, who is an actual puppet of ours. But nevertheless, the message has to be the same. We're not going to support this anymore. That's about as good as it gets from our standpoint.
Man, that is really a sad commentary on the state of affairs in the United States today, when probably the best we can realistically hope for is to cause no further damage and to hope we can avoid an explosion there. But so much damage has been done because of the last number of years, and not just 2 or 3, but probably going back beyond that, that probably is the most realistic hope that we can have, because if we don't do that, it can get worse, and that's what I'm concerned about. But in any case, appreciate you coming on today, Doug, and giving us this insights into what is genuinely in America's interest in both of these two theaters of war. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Oh, and I'm sorry, but one more thing before we go. Was there anything new going on in our country, our choice, that we need to know about?
Yeah, there's a lot, and I've got to get back to Orlando soon because so much is happening down there. And rather than go into detail, I'll just tell people that starting in mid-March and April, we're going to start producing series of events series of what you would call a television show, but we're live streaming over the internet, that will take us to many corners of the United States, that will allow us to talk to many people around the country that are members and also people who are not members about a whole range of things, about the economy, what can be done, what needs to be done, improving our way of life, suppressing criminality, and finally, truly securing the border. And the other thing is, and this is just an observation, I wish I saw more evidence for a systematic, coherent plan going forward to both secure the border and expel the illegals. You know, again, as I've said many times, the easiest thing to do is you give people 120 days to get out on their own and tell them if they leave on their own and they can take whatever they own with them. And if they register on the way out with us, we'll consider them for re-entry in the future. But at that point, when the final clock strikes midnight after 120 days or something, and you're here, you're going to feel the full weight of law fall upon you. I still think that's a good way to do it, but I don't see that happening. In fact, I'm not sure what is happening. And the best way to do this is to publish, a systematic step-by-step plan that reflects the president's intentions. I don't see that yet. Do you?
I have not. In fact, that's been a compliment that we've seen a number of these, big high-profile splashy media raids and whatnot. But I mean, I see that as actions. I don't see it as a strategy, and I'm hoping to see one to something that could be sustainable and that could be, taken care of, because obviously you can't just get rid of 11 million people in one fell swoop, because then that could have ramifications on our own economy and farming and all that kind of stuff. So somehow we've got to get it done. But I'd just like to see a plan. And so far, all I've seen is a few tactical actions.
Yeah, well, these are some of the things we want to focus on at Our Country, Our Choice in the new programming that we'll have in March and April. And that's why we're going to various places in the country, try to get answers to these questions. We'll see. I feel it's a lot larger than 11 million. And the good news is that our economy will not suffer. Our economy, in most cases, will benefit because we're spending billions on free healthcare, free education, free this, free that we don't have to spend anymore. But that's neither here nor there. We'll sort through that in the future, one way or the other. Let's hope for a clear plan.
Yeah, love to see that, and love to see your plan if the government doesn't provide one. But again, thank you very much for coming on today, Doug. We'll look forward to hearing more about that in the future.
Okay, Dan. Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't on the way out. Also, let you know Larry Johnson is going to be with us at 2:00 today, just about an hour from now. Always a fan favorite. You're not going to want to miss that. Also, remind you that we are on podcast now. I know some of your friends may not be able to watch on video, but they do like podcasts. Just let them know to go wherever they get their podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, any of those places. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and you'll find us waiting there. And then also another thing I want to remind you about is just that later this afternoon we actually have a triple header going on, or almost a quadruple header going on today. The last one is going to be something that's a little bit different. It's going to be Stephen Marsh, the author of The Next Civil War, is going to tell us how the chances of a U.S. Civil War are greater than you may realize. And this is a little bit sobering. I did a show, I guess, a couple of months back, right before the election, actually, on the prospects of this. Well, now we have the actual author of the book himself to bring things up to date from what happened and what the prospects are from when he wrote this in 2022. Do not miss that show this afternoon at 3 p.m. Thanks very much, and we'll see you at that point on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.